Hi, my name is Gonawela. Welcome back to the Burn Bag podcast. It's been a crazy couple of weeks here in Washington, D.C. We've been tracking a bunch of various developments since the Burn Bag has been releasing episodes in 2026. We started off the year covering Venezuela. Last week, we were able to talk with Dr. Yulia Joja on Russia's strategy in the Middle East. And this week, we are talking about Syria. Syria is in the middle of one of the most consequential transitions in Middle East right now. After the fall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, President Ahmed al-Sharaa's government is trying to consolidate power over a fragmented country. And nowhere is that more delicate than in the northeast, where the Syrian Democratic Forces once governed autonomously with U.S. backing. Now, after months of stalled negotiations and a dramatic January escalation, we're seeing a phased integration deal. To help us break it all down, I'm joined by Charles Lister, Senior Fellow and Director of the Syria Initiative at the Middle East Institute. Charles has spent years tracking Syria's armed actors, insurgency dynamics, and the counterterrorism landscape, and he's been closely following the negotiations and the implementation challenges shaping this moment. So, Charles, thanks for joining me here today.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, Andre.
So, Charles, I want to set the stage for our audience. Our audience certainly knew about the Syrian civil war that dominated the 2010s and the 2020s. And obviously, a lot of us know about the fall of Assad, but we're not necessarily maybe as aware of what's been going on since Assad fell. So, when Assad fell in late 2024, who actually inherited the state in a practical organizational sense? I mean, what kind of government did Ahmed al-Sharaa build? Who is he actually? And how consolidated is that today?
Yeah, so all great questions with big, potentially long, complicated answers.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, the multiple armed groups entered Damascus on December the 8th, 2024, from the south and from the north. The most powerful of those groups, the most powerful of those entities was a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which is the group that was led by Ahmed al-Sharaa, who is now the transitional president. Long story short, Ahmed al-Sharaa and his group HTS were the spearhead of a massive military offensive that started right up in the north of Syria and methodically marched south into Damascus 10 days later. Dramatic sequence of events. The speed of that advance was unquestionably unprecedented, but also, a huge shock to Syria, to Syrians, but also to many of us who have worked on Syria for so long. But as the spearhead of that offensive, Ahmed al-Sharaa was the most powerful man to walk into Damascus, and he was basically the only reason why this whole, historical event happened. And so he basically became the de facto head of what was initially called the caretaker government. So for about a couple months, we had a caretaker government in Damascus that was entirely composed of what had been HTS's semi-technocratic government that they had been running in northwestern Syria for about 4 or 5 years. And so their Minister of Transport became the Minister of Transport in Damascus, the Minister of Economy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one quick brief anecdote just to make that very clean transition maybe slightly more interesting and slightly more nuanced is that, yes, that kind of entity took over. But there's a fantastic photograph out there that was taken in one of the big government buildings in Damascus, I think on December the 9th, so the day after they walked in, where basically the entirety of Bashar al-Assad's cabinet sat next to their HTS counterparts. So the Minister of Transport that hired by Bashar al-Assad sat next to HTS's Minister of Transport, and all the way around the table, a room of about 40 people. I should say Assad's Minister of Interior, his intelligence chiefs, his Minister of Defense, for obvious reasons, did not stick around for this meeting, but almost the entirety of the rest of the civil cabinet did. And so, long story short, that was mostly because many of these individuals had been in communication with Ahmed al-Sharaa and his movement for a number of years. And as HTS marched south, there was fighting, unquestionably, at certain areas, but there was a lot more peaceful surrenders, negotiated surrenders by the regime, by regime forces. And that kind of created, there was no massacres, there was no mass killing, there was no mass violence. And most regime forces just took off their uniforms and went back to sort of civilian life. And that kind of created some confidence for a much cleaner takeover than you would ever have expected, or handover than you would ever have expected, given the severity of the nearly 14 years of civil war. So that was kind of the first phase of that transition. We then had that kind of HTS-dominated caretaker government for a couple months, and then we had the formation of what we now have, which is called the transitional government. Out of 24 cabinet ministers, 4 of them came from HTS and 20 were from outside. And almost all of those are hugely qualified international experts, people who have worked for the New York Fed, people who have worked for Fannie Mae, for Ernst & Young all around the world, are now heading up ministries in Damascus. And so the sovereign ministries, as they're called in Syria, the Defense, Interior, Presidency, and the Foreign Ministry, are run by HTS figures. But all the rest of the ministries out there, which frankly are the key to Syria's economic recovery, are all run by real technocrats, real professionals who've spent most of their careers working in Europe and the US. So a big shift from that complete HTS-dominated caretaker government to this transitional government that we have today.
And just to paint sort of the picture for our audience and to dwell on the speed of the takeover militarily by HTS of Damascus, is it accurate, or is there some parallel to how the Taliban took Kabul, in those last few weeks of the Afghanistan war? Is there some parallel to that in a practical sense of how they took over, how that transition occurred, or is it just fundamentally too different?
Well, I think a lot of people have tried to make parallels between Syria and Afghanistan for a number of reasons. The other one being that Ahmed al-Sharaa himself used to be a member of al-Qaeda, and so that sort of makes him look fairly similar to the Taliban taking over a government. My bias as a Syria specialist is there's way too many differences between the two cases to say that they're similar. I mean, yes, we had a very rapid change of power. To that extent, it's similar, but very different backgrounds for the prior years in Syria for 13, 14 years. I think actually far more complexity on the Syrian case than on the Afghan case. Far many different actors took part in this military offensive with wildly different aims and objectives. And then, of course, you have this very unusual, sticking around of most of the prior Assad regime cabinet, which also was not entirely the way that we saw things take place in Afghanistan, whereas it was much more of a switch from, one entity to another. So yes, there's similarities, but again, I would say I'm biased in saying that, I think Syria is so unique in so many different ways that it needs to be viewed through its own unique lens.
Gotcha. So in that moment when HTS took over Damascus, what was Syria like in terms of who controlled which territories at the end of 2024, particularly in the Northeast?
Yeah. So when that dramatic shift happened, and the Assad regime collapsed, basically Syria was split in two, not half and half, but there were two entities in Syria. There was the new government-held areas of Syria under HTS, interim or caretaker control, and that was about 79% of the country. And the rest was in the northeast, which was controlled by a movement called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was basically an umbrella of Kurdish militias tied to a movement called the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK initially, and a few Arab militias and one Christian, Syrian Christian militia. The SDF, to call them by their acronym, of course, most famously, America's primary partner in the fight against ISIS going back to 2015. And they had run and controlled this northeastern corner of the country for nearly a decade, have and had their own kind of political agenda, driven mostly by the Kurdish, constituency within their movement. Very strong emphasis on sort of women's empowerment, but very closely tied to this kind of almost utopian, Leninist, socialist, agrarian political philosophy. But they had that status for 10 years because of their relationship with the United States, because of their effective fight against ISIS. They were the primary force with US support that rolled back ISIS's territorial caliphate. And after that, they found themselves in control of this significant chunk of Syrian territory.
So, I mean, they were able to function autonomously while Assad was still in power in Damascus. Structurally, I guess, what made the SDF's autonomy in those regions actually sustainable? Was it the U.S. support? Was it something else? Was it just the way the government was sort of relatively weak? What made it actually sustainable? And what changed in the moment that the new government took over in Damascus?
Yeah. Well, I think whilst Assad was around, while his regime was around, the broad spectrum opposition focus was on fighting the regime, not on the SDF. Now, there were, and it should be said, there were periods of time earlier on in the conflict where opposition fighters or opposition factions, and what became the SDF were fighting. But by and large, the opposition's focus was fighting the regime. The SDF's focus with US support was on fighting ISIS. And so in many ways, there was just kind of two tracks of very different parallel activity happening on different sides of the map, which meant that, whilst the opposition continued to struggle be engaged in this struggle against the regime, the SDF did its, undertook its mission against ISIS. And then both entities found themselves in control of certain areas of territory. Certainly the opposition controlled much less territory than the SDF. In terms of the viability, I mean, listen, the SDF was presenting itself. They had this entity called the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. That was basically their governing entity. And the Autonomous Administration presented itself as a governing entity. So it sought to hire and pay the salaries and to employ tens of thousands of people throughout northeastern Syria for civilian jobs in service provision and core parts of their political system, and of course their military, the SDF itself, and their local security forces, which were called the Asaish. And the only way they were able to do that, to afford to do that, was because the SDF found themselves in this northeastern corner of Syria under control of maybe 80% of Syria's natural resources, predominantly oil and gas, but also the agrarian agricultural belt of the country was also under their control. And that afforded them the kind of revenues that they could afford to pay the salaries and prop up a state like this, or a semi-autonomous entity like this. Having said that, as the years went by throughout the SDF's existence, those revenues declined and they were hiring more and more people in a bloated bureaucracy. And so every single year they were running massive deficits. And so financially they were increasingly becoming untenable, but they were hanging on. And then, of course, militarily, yes, having US troops in and around acted as a kind of geopolitical mechanism of support, but I don't say guarantee because, and again, not to get too much in the weeds, but the core of the Kurdish, entity within the SDF was tied to this PKK movement, which I should say the US government's designated as a terrorist organization for decades, but also only really has existed since the 1970s to fight Turkey, who lies just across the northern border. And so the SDF's existence, and particularly the SDF's existence as a US-supported entity, not just angered Turkey, but triggered several successive Turkish military interventions in northern Syria over previous years. And at no point in any of those did the US military ever intervene. So that's why I describe it as the US presence maybe provided some level of support, but certainly not a guarantee over the SDF's kind of political project. At no point did the US ever step in to defend that. So now we're in a place where, and I'm sure we'll get to this, where the existence of the SDF is very much under question, but we're now seeing people asking those questions, like, did the SDF ever really understand that the US wasn't there to protect their political statelet, but it was there to partner with them in a counterterrorism mission. And so those definitions and the words we use around them matter a lot, especially as we look back at the past, but as we, of course, look forward now as well.
So essentially, it's the difference between being a partner and an actual ally.
Yes. US diplomats in particular had consistently over the last nearly 10 years used a specific language when they described the relationship with the SDF, which was a variation of it was a tactical, transactional, and temporary relationship. Now, notwithstanding the fact that senior US diplomats consistently used that language, I'm not convinced the SDF ever really listened and took that on board. I think they always had a sense to which the US would be more than that if push came to shove. And of course, in recent events, again, as I'm sure we'll discuss, they had a very rude awakening that the US was not there to protect and to defend a political entity.
Yeah, and can you give us a sense of what the SDF's relationships were like with other non-state actors? For example, what was HTS doing around this time? How were they interacting with or engaging with, maybe working against or working with the SDF? Were there any other non-state actors who were also sort of in that mix, maybe to a lesser degree?
You mean while before Assad fell?
Yeah,
So in
before
that,
Assad
yeah.
fell, during the 2010s, the first part of the 2020s, and so on.
Mhm. They largely kept to themselves because of those two very differing missions, which were
Yeah.
geographically separated on a map. From time to time, there were reports, and I was aware of at least a couple of them being true, that there were, messages and communications exchanged between HTS and the SDF. But, in terms of public rhetoric, both were calling each other the enemy for a very long time. It's just that they weren't really engaged geographically in contesting lines of control until Assad fell, when suddenly they found themselves, diametrically opposite actors. Beyond that, the SDF, speaking of other actors, the SDF continued with US support to tackle the ISIS challenge in their territorial region. Of course, they continued to face the challenges presented by Turkey, the Turkish military, but also Turkish proxies within the Syrian opposition. And so, speaking of other actors, that was the line of contestation that did exist. Those actors did not include HTS. HTS was never involved in any of Turkey's military interventions. And then internally within the internally within the SDF was one other issue, which again became very relevant in more recent weeks, was the extent to which they sought to represent beyond their Kurdish, core. And in that sense, the SDF controlled basically large parts of three provinces in Syria, Hasakeh, Raqqa, and Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor and most of Raqqa are wildly dominated by Arab populations, Arab communities. They are not Kurdish regions of Syria. And yet they fell under and remained under SDF control for close to a decade. That SDF relationship with Arab communities became increasingly fraught and tense as those 10 years passed by, and particularly after Assad fell. And so if I was to use, Arab tribes as another kind of actor, going back to your question, and that's one I would really highlight as very, very significant, and it's certainly proven very significant over the last few weeks.
So after Assad falls, we still have this fragmented country. You talked a little bit about the SDF sort of state of being, towards the end of 2024, financially, militarily, politically. You just referenced, some of the fraught tensions between the SDF and the Arabs who were living in some of those areas they controlled. So the question of integration once Assad falls, how was al-Sharaa thinking about it in Damascus? How was the SDF thinking about it in the Northeast? And how was Washington trying to advocate for integration? And what was the approach? What was the strategy? What were the sort of
Yeah.
the frames of mind as we're coming to that, first part of 2025?
hmm So, it took a while for everybody, including Ahmed al-Sharaa and the SDF, to kind of swallow and digest the reality that Assad's regime had collapsed in such quick order. Took some time for the dust to settle and everyone to figure out, what the future held and where things should go and where we're going. Um, for its part, the US was very quick, I think, to calculate that despite the challenges associated with, having someone like Ahmed al-Sharaa as the, interim or transitional president, given his background, the US was very quick to calculate that there were very few, if any, other options to al-Sharaa, and that the potential rewards that may come from being able to work with a sovereign government in Damascus instead of certain non-state actors somewhere else in Syria were manifold. And so the calculation was very quickly made at the tail end of the Biden administration that there needed to be engagement. And so, almost within days of Assad's fall, under Biden, the State Department sent a very senior delegation with, although they weren't pictured, a Department of Defense delegation who joined them to meet Ahmed al-Sharaa and to have that initial conversation. And the Trump administration spent a few months figuring out how to respond. Certainly in its early weeks, the Trump administration's public position was that this guy's a terrorist and we want nothing to do with him. And over time, that changed. It changed mostly because the Europeans and the regional states were all singing from the same hymn sheet saying, yes, he has a challenging history, but actually in the first few months, they've taken mostly all of the right decisions they needed to in terms of a transitional process. And that if Syria has any chance of getting through this transition, it's going to need all of our help and support and our pressure and our influence. And so collectively, the Trump administration then made that decision too. And because of all of that story I've just told, the viability of something like the SDF in the Northeast just disappeared. The idea that there could still be this third way that we had under Assad, we'd had the regime, we'd had the opposition, and we'd had the SDF. Now that the regime was gone, there was just no way that a non-state actor could continue to control a quarter of the country and a large majority of its natural assets in the long term without major war. And so the US calculation was, well, the only way forward is integration. Now, there's some context here, not to speak for forever, but the context here is that while Assad was around and the US government had consistently assumed that Assad was going nowhere and there's no way he was ever going to leave or be defeated, the US government plan at that time was to convince the SDF to integrate under Assad's regime. So this has always been the approach. Both Democratic and Republican administrations worked on various plans to convince the SDF to enter into negotiations with Assad and to integrate into his state. And so the fact that we made the same decision with a new government in Damascus isn't particularly surprising. That's always been the model, that we wanted to be able to protect or to save, the best of the SDF by integrating it into the sovereign government. But of course, it was almost impossible to do that under Assad, and it became much more feasible to do that under this government, which is why by March 2025, so only like 3.5 months after Assad's fall, we had what was called the Framework Agreement, the March 10th Framework Agreement, whereby the SDF and Ahmed al-Sharaa agreed that there needed to be an integration. There wasn't any much more to that, but it was a big public ceremony with photographs, and the SDF leader and Ahmed al-Sharaa both signed this document, and that created an environment in which the integration negotiations started, and those ran through the rest of 2025. Very long, complicated story short, all of those US-mediated negotiations never resulted in a comprehensive agreement being signed. And I emphasize that because there was an agreement in October last year over a comprehensive integration agreement. All of the details were agreed in October, but the SDF didn't sign it because their leadership in the negotiations said they needed to return to northeastern Syria to internally discuss with other elements to make sure that this agreement was acceptable. That's when it all started to fall apart.
Following March, then nothing was actually agreed to on paper. But I guess, with that October idea of an agreement, the one that, wasn't really signed, what was sort of in there with regards to, say, Kurdish rights, ministry posts, defense integration, interior restructuring? Like, what was in that initial October agreement that they just did not sign?
Yeah. So the agreement at that point was the best deal that was on the table throughout this period, including up until today. And it would have given the SDF 3 divisions within the Ministry of Defense to integrate all of its military forces. So the SDF is the military force. So the SDF would have been given 3 divisions within the MOD. They would then have also had their local security forces, what's called the Asayish, equal probably in number to the SDF military force, integrated under the Ministry of Interior and given full, basically localized authority to secure local security in Kurdish areas throughout all of the northeast of Syria. So that whole kind of 25% of the country would have remained under the control of men and women who had been part of the SDF as a military actor or the Asayish as a local security actor. So that's on the security side of things. Then, more broadly, the SDF was being offered the Deputy Minister of Defense position, several other potential cabinet positions if there was a cabinet reshuffle, potentially in education, given that that's a more sensitive issue, although I should add the current Minister of Education is Kurdish in Damascus. They would then have had their whole autonomous administration, their kind of governing entity, would have been dissolved as an entity, but all of their employees would have been hired into their pre-existing positions across this northeastern region of Syria. So basically, long story short, the government would have taken control, but all of those individuals, if they held guns or if they held pens or anything else, would have remained in their positions, their respective positions. And then finally, in terms of Kurdish rights, we would have had, the full package of Kurdish rights in terms of language, citizenship. I should add, by the way, that not in any of Syria's history have Kurds ever been permitted citizenship, and going throughout the whole 50 plus years of Assad family rule. So the Kurds would have been, as we have now had, granted full Syrian citizenship rights, language rights. So education curriculum can be taught in Kurdish areas. Kurdish language will be acknowledged as a national language of Syria. Nowruz, as Kurdish New Year, will be acknowledged as a public holiday for all of Syria. So all of those things were on the table back then. And just to doubly emphasize, all of those things are now real. They haven't all now been announced through a presidential decree in Syria. So Nowruz will be celebrated in, maybe 5 or 6 weeks' time. Kurdish language curriculum are already being written up within the Ministry of Education. Citizenship is to be granted to all Kurds within the next 2 or 3 weeks by the Ministry of Interior. So things have moved very quickly as this kind of integration agreement is just getting started.
So when we're talking about the agreement, and I guess like all of those great things, from my view, and I mean, I guess all of those great things that were in there in October, why did the negotiations break down afterwards? Was it something that was structural? Was it something that was personality driven?
Yeah. Well, from what I am aware of from many different circles, including the US mediator team and others, the main issue was that Mazloum Abdi, who is the leader of the SDF and the head of the negotiating team, would come to the table and be very pragmatic, very constructive, very friendly, and like in October, come to basically say across the table, I agree with this whole framework. This is good. This is the way forward. And then he would end the meeting by saying, but I cannot sign and commit to it without returning to my areas and consulting with other members of my movement. That's when things get a little bit more complicated. The fact of the matter is that the SDF contains a certain number of foreign, non-Syrian PKK senior figures. 200 of them have already left Syria in the last week, very quietly, going back to the PKK's headquarters in northern Iraq. And the reality is, and this is not my words, but coming from very senior US officials who were running these negotiations, Mazloum had to go back to northeastern Syria and consult with the PKK leadership. And there were individuals within that circle who did not want integration to happen under any circumstances. And that was his main problem. So it wasn't that Mazloum and his negotiating team didn't want to move forward, but that there was a sense to which he couldn't for himself and for his own security, commit to a deal that wasn't also consulted and agreed with by this wider kind of shadowy circle, some of which is in northeastern Syria, some of which was outside of Syria. And that was the consistent challenge. I think when we saw hostilities erupt earlier this year and the SDF squeezed into a very tight corner, there was a very blunt reality whereby, purely from the PKK perspective, they had lost so much already by stalling negotiations and turning to hostilities that they had no choice but to accept an integration deal at that point. And that's really why we are where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, why did actual fighting start breaking out in January? I mean, I remember sort of scrolling through social media, through X and through all of the, folks who were sort of tracking this stuff. And suddenly I just remember seeing just some of these horrific images of just violence in Syria, just crimes perpetrated, and so on. How did it break down? Not only we obviously talked about how the negotiations broke down in October, but how did it just devolve into actual armed conflict in January?
Yeah. So it's complicated, but I mean, basically what happened was the talks, going back to what we were just talking about, throughout this process of negotiations, the US had set deadlines for a full agreement. Now, the first deadline was August 2025. That, of course, passed without an agreement. The second deadline was October. And when that passed without any agreement, the US and Turkey and Damascus all said, basically in unison, the end of 2025 is the deadline. And if it's not met, we can't guarantee that something else may occur. And so that deadline also passed with no agreement. And so right as 2026 began, there were many indications that both sides were preparing for some form of a standoff. On January the 5th evening, there were, January 3rd, 4th, and 5th, there had been very small scale tit for tat, occasional firing from a machine gun across the front line at each other, but no major clashes. And on January 5th night, suddenly out of nowhere, 2 SDF suicide drones struck 2 government police vehicles in a populated village in eastern rural Aleppo, and killed several policemen and civilians who were in the immediate vicinity. As this incident happened, major accusations started to be flown around. The SDF issued a public official statement saying that this had been a car crash, that there was no evidence of any, hostilities. Of course, anyone who spent 5 minutes looking at conflicts, 2 vehicles with massive explosions in the roofs did not point to any kind of a car crash. But that incident then led to the following morning major clashes around that front line, which then spread into Aleppo city, where SDF-linked forces have held out in 2 urban districts of Aleppo city for years. Prior to Assad's falling, with great deal of Assad regime support, after Assad's fall, they just remained where they were. And again, not to go into too much detail, but the status of those SDF-linked forces in Aleppo city had been the subject of major negotiations in 2025. There was a deal in the spring of 2025 that the SDF should withdraw all of its military forces from Aleppo city, so what we will call the SDF, and leave behind only these local security forces known as the Asayish. And along with the SDF's withdrawal, they should withdraw all heavy weaponry. So that deal was done. There was convoys of SDF fighters who left. The government's accusation after that all along was not all of the SDF left, and they've kept lots of their heavy weapons. When conflict broke out in those 2 districts called Sheikh Maqsood and al-Ashrafiyah on January the 6th this year, the SDF-linked forces clearly still had heavy weapons. They were firing artillery and mortars, heavy machine guns, anti-aircraft weapons, anti-tank missiles. So they clearly hadn't fully, abided by the terms of that initial agreement. And I only say that to underline the fundamental lack of trust that both sides held throughout all of those negotiations. Both sides didn't really believe that the other had the best of intentions, and neither side truly believed that the other side was implementing what they had agreed to, which is why we had this very rapid escalation. And again, cutting a really, really long and complicated story short, those two districts fell to government control in about 4 days. Actually, the scale of fighting and casualties was very low when you compare it to previous bouts of major conflict in Syria, both before Assad's fall and after. And in that Aleppo conflict, 98% of casualties, deaths and injuries, were military fighters. So it was very much a military on military confrontation in that respect before it spread further northeast.
So speaking of, rapid escalation, and you also mentioned the government being able to take key areas within about 4 days. I read one report, right, that the SDF lost roughly about 80% of its territory in, 24 hours. And this was largely due to the defections by Arab fighters who I believe were under the SDF. What was going on there, and like what did that tell us about really the SDF's internal cohesion? Is this percolating, from those tensions between the SDF and the Arab folks who it was ruling over in certain areas, or was this something a little bit different around the organization's legitimacy or just tribal allegiances?
Well, if I rewind the clock a little bit, in I think early February 2025, after my first visit back to all across Syria after Assad's fall, I wrote an article in Foreign Policy, which I think Foreign Policy decided to use quite a controversial title, which made it sound like I was making a more aggressive point than I really was. But my main message was, having traveled all around Syria in all of these different areas of the country, one thing had become most clear, which was that the SDF was no longer a viable actor in Syria. The prospect of the regime having fallen and Syrians desperately desiring the country to reunite and recover, the SDF was perceived very widely across the country as an occupier, and so the SDF never really understood that. But within that narrative, within that reality, was this Arab tension issue that I talked about a little earlier. The Arab communities that dominated at least 80% of SDF-controlled territories saw Assad's fall and the emergence of a Sunni-led government as their dreams come true. As the long-suppressed majority of the country being represented in Damascus was always their demand. It was a demand why so many of them took to their feet in 2011 to protest and call for the regime's downfall. But the fact that the SDF so consistently refused to go along with integration meant that these Arab communities were growing exasperated. To the extent to which, to be blunt, ISIS found a potential breeding ground of recruits within some of the Arab communities under SDF control, because they were so mad at the SDF, so disenfranchised by the SDF's treatment of them. And I should say, since Assad's fall basically in 2025, over 900 Arab men in SDF-held areas were arrested for posting statements of support to the government in Damascus on social media. Some of those 900 men were arrested because they were stopped at checkpoints and found to have a picture of Ahmed al-Sharaa on their cell phone. So that to that extent, the Arab communities were being oppressed. They were not free to even celebrate Assad's fall. In fact, on the 1-year anniversary of Assad's fall on December the 8th, 2025, just a couple of months ago, the SDF banned in all of its areas any celebration of Assad's fall. And
Incredible.
this enraged the Arab communities. So when we had this 4-day conflict in Aleppo city, which then threatened to move into the core of SDF-held northeastern Syria, the Arab communities were preparing for, something big. So when the government signaled that they were willing to militarily expand the conflict to the northeast, it was literally overnight. 80% of the SDF-held territory, which was all Arab majority regions, flipped without a fight. The SDF were forced to evacuate and leave, and the Arab communities took control of their areas. And there was very little conflict in that overnight change of control. And so again, that more than anything, underlying the extent to which the SDF had fundamentally failed, to calculate what Assad's fall meant for Syria and for the SDF itself. And secondarily, they had failed to really integrate Arab communities into their political project. And sadly for the SDF, they've paid the price for that.
So now they obviously came back to the negotiating table and now we have this deal. I mean, was it essentially, hey, our position is absolutely untenable. Like, we are, dying out here. Like, we're losing territory. We're losing legitimacy. Was it just essentially desperation that drove them back to the table to basically sign this agreement?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to a blunt extent or a general extent, perhaps yes. I mean, they had no choice but to go back to the table. The government, the government stands rightly accused of committing significant crimes against minority communities elsewhere in Syria in 2025, and so there was a great deal of concern that if this conflict in the northeast continued for too long, that there was a danger of, really vicious fighting happening. The main reason why it didn't is that the government, right on the very first day of hostilities, made the decision that they would not enter and that they would not seek to enter Kurdish majority areas of the northeast. So basically what we saw in a very general sense was the government advancing, strongly facilitated by tribes flipping their allegiance, advancing only into Arab majority areas. And once they reached Kurdish majority areas, they stopped. That was then basically the opening for negotiations. I think in many ways it was the government saying, we would prefer at this point that we talk this out and figure it out, and you guys have got no choice but to integrate. And of course, the US government, State Department, CENTCOM, as in US Central Command, stepped in at that point and basically forced the SDF to the table too, and pushed both actors across the finishing line by January 29th, January 30th, when we finally had this comprehensive agreement, which, again, not to go into every single detail, wasn't as advantageous as the deal that they were offered back in October last year. But also, it wasn't a complete capitulation either. And in many ways, Damascus, I think, was convinced to be a little bit more flexible and generous in its offerings for the sake of trying to make sure that there was a deal that wouldn't fall apart once it started to be implemented.
So the agreement in January essentially, was it lesser, it was less advantageous to the SDF versus what they were offered in October? Like they sort of lost ground in some areas, or?
Yeah, so I mean, when those talks resumed after these
Yeah.
dramatic SDF losses, Mazloum Abdi, as the leader of the SDF, went to Damascus, and one of the first things he put on the table was, we would like to have our 3 divisions in the 3 provinces of northeastern Syria, integrated into the state. But of course, he'd lost 2 of those provinces and half of the other one. And so he was basically saying, can I have all my territory back? And can we rewind back to October? That, to be honest, that set the talks off on a very sour note. In fact, when he said that some of the US delegation threatened to leave as mediators. So what the deal that we now have is that the SDF gets to have 3 brigades, not divisions,
Okay.
in 3 Kurdish majority regions of Syria. So a much smaller pocket of the country, but from the SDF's priority perspective, they are in the Kurdish majority areas. So the city of Qamishli, the city of Hasakeh, and the town of Kobani. And so that's what they got. So a significantly smaller chunk of territory, but a concentration within the Kurdish majority areas. And then on top of that, they got all the Kurdish rights, which I listed out earlier. In fact, those were announced before the integration deal was announced. They were announced by the president, Ahmed al-Sharaa. And then they are getting the governor of Hasakeh. So this one governorate, this one province in the northeast, will be under a Kurdish governor, who's been named and unofficially confirmed by Damascus, and he came from within the SDF. They'll have the deputy minister of defense, although that individual is not yet confirmed, and that they will have local security control of the local security personnel, Kurdish personnel, in those 3 areas.
So, I mean, is this the end of autonomous SDF governance, or is this more like a hybrid of, some autonomous provisions? And I don't even know what I mean by that,
Yeah.
or,
It
with the
depends. Yeah.
government.
It depends who you ask. And this
Yeah.
is my main worry about the implementation of this agreement. I mean, we're only about a week in, and so far, so good. But the anticipation is that this may take 6 to 9 months to fully implement this full
Okay.
integration. So we're very early days in that sense. The real challenge in my mind is that as far as the government is concerned, they've basically defeated the SDF and forced it to dissolve and integrate into the state. Yes, they get to still have their personnel holding weapons, local security personnel holding weapons in Kurdish areas, but they're not an autonomous entity. They no longer have a political project. That's the government's perspective. Many within the SDF are publicly proclaiming this proclaiming this agreement as a victory, saying, we finally got what we wanted: semi-autonomy, a Kurdish project in Syria. My opinion is, that those elements within the SDF are just living on a fantasy land. The US government isn't thinking that way. The Iraqi Kurdistan government is not thinking that way. No one is thinking that way other than elements within the SDF. So the source of my worry here is if and when we get to a point where those very differing interpretations begin to become very clear, we then have the potential reason or cause for renewed hostilities. We're definitely not there yet. We've seen both sides demonstrate real flexibility and pragmatism over the last week, which is really encouraging, and a lot of patience, including when things haven't quite gone to plan. And that's really encouraging. But we're very, very early days. And as I continue to see these statements coming out of very senior SDF Kurdish leaders saying things like, we intend to continue resistance for many years. This is a great victory for Rojava, as they call it, their kind of
Yeah.
Kurdish political entity. The blunt reality is that the agreement they have signed is anything but a victory for Rojava. It is a victory for Kurdish citizens of Syria to be able to, live hopefully at peace in a reunited country that's in the very early stages of economic recovery and everything else. But to present it as a political victory, I think is both false but also quite dangerous if it sustains.
And I mean, if it sustains and we do have renewed hostilities, I mean, given the way in which the Syrian government was able to defeat the SDF in January, essentially, I mean, what's the most plausible failure mode of, integration not necessarily working out? Would it be like really localized clashes on the smaller scale, a larger insurgency, some instability in detention camps, or like what would it actually be? Like, I mean, like given the reduced capacity, I guess, for SDF or aligned groups to really resist, I mean, are we looking at smaller scale or larger scale conflict? And obviously that's difficult to say, but
I think it would depend. I mean, it would depend on a lot of things, but it would depend on if we do return to hostilities, how soon do we return to them? I mean, if we return to hostilities tomorrow, then I think large-scale violence would be almost inevitable. If we return to hostilities 4 months from now and most of the integration had happened, then I think it would be, much more localized and much more specific. Damascus's main concern is having to face a long-term Kurdish insurgency. And in that sense, I think they foresee the integration happening, but that some elements within the SDF, some hardline elements, basically don't go along with it and choose to continue to carry arms. If I was to pick any potential scenario, that's probably the most likely. I do think that looking at other areas of Syria that, frankly, in 2025 saw far greater, far bloodier conflict than what we've seen in the northeast, that have then settled very quickly. And yes, people remain distrustful, they remain very tense, but we haven't seen return to hostilities, gives me some hope that a sufficient majority of the population of northeastern Syria, so sort of taking the SDF and guys with guns out of the equation, a sufficient majority of the population do not want to go back to conflict. They do not want the conflict to resume. They don't want it to escalate. And that does tend to, and that has over the last 12 months elsewhere in Syria, had a pretty significant effect on calming tensions, or at least preventing tensions from spiraling out of control. So if I was to have kind of cautious optimism, that's a significant part for it, that those who may want to return to fighting will be the minority, and that may at least restrain their ability to act.
Okay, now what about ISIS? Because I mean, ISIS still exists. I mean, I feel like I haven't heard about as many attacks in the aftermath of Assad's fall, but I mean, the group is always capable of adapting. So, I mean, does a successfully integrated Syrian state, does it actually improve counterterrorism opportunities, ability to actually engage in counterterrorism, or does it introduce, I mean, even new threats, new vulnerabilities, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it should, in theory, significantly improve the Syrian capacity to defeat ISIS. I mean, one of the long-running problems we have had is how best to explain this. I mean, when the SDF became America's partner and the global coalition's partner against ISIS, the challenge that they were facing was a territorial ISIS entity. And so the military challenge was to retake territory and to hold territory with huge amounts of US air and artillery support. And the SDF proved pretty capable at doing that. I mean, they sacrificed more than 10,000 fighters, and they did liberate the vast majority of ISIS's territorial state because it was in that northeastern and eastern part of the country. The problem that we began to face was that once that mission was accomplished, the counter-ISIS challenge changed. It wasn't about liberating territory anymore. It was about rooting out sleeper cells and collecting intelligence and gaining trust of local communities. And by the way, it doesn't mean gaining trust of Kurdish communities. You need to gain trust of the Arab communities. And that was the crux of the SDF's real challenge on the second phase of the counterterrorism fight, is that they didn't actually have, frankly, because of who they were and their political ideology and who people perceived them to be, they didn't have the capacity internally to do that counterterrorism more mission rather than a counterinsurgency, which is what they were doing when they were liberating territory. And so, to use some data and statistics here, in 2024, when Assad was still around, 2024 was the first year where month on month ISIS demonstrated a consistent resurgence on Syrian soil. And 2/3 of that resurgence activity was in SDF-held northeastern Syria. So in other words, ISIS was surging in SDF areas in 2024. When Assad fell, it was a huge shock to the system, to ISIS. Why? Mostly because ISIS had relied upon the persistence of the Assad regime and everything that was associated with it: brutality, lack of hope for the future, disenfranchisement, economic crisis, everything else, corruption. ISIS relied on all of those things tied to the Assad regime to recruit and to justify its localized existence. When Assad fell, that was suddenly gone. ISIS's operational tempo collapsed to nearly zero in the month after Assad fell. But then it started to tick up again over the last 12 months. And 89% of ISIS attacks in 2025 were in SDF-held areas of Syria, and 11% of them were in government-held areas. And let me just remind listeners, SDF-held areas of Syria represented about 23% of the country. So 89% of ISIS attacks were in 23% of the country, and 11% was in 77% of the country, which tells you a lot about where ISIS saw its opportunity. Its opportunity lay in exploiting the SDF's inability to acquire and sustain the support of Arab communities. Now that the SDF has collapsed, and it's very early days, so this is not going to become a hard and fast rule. ISIS will adapt and recover to an extent. But ISIS has dropped back to almost zero since the SDF basically was forced into this integration agreement, which does show that it has created another kind of crisis of confidence within ISIS. Like, where do we go from here? Now we've lost this potential opportunity. And then the last thing
no
I would say,
incentive.
no incentive, exactly. And then the last thing I'd say is, where we're going now, unquestionably, is that ISIS will turn its attention on the transitional government itself. I mean, ISIS has written a whole bunch of editorials over the last few months, labeling President Ahmed al-Sharaa as an apostate, the greatest apostate of the Middle East, the number one threat. So they've already been framing their new kind of adaptation in that sense. But that's because now they see this transitional government as an existential danger. There is also a reason, by the way, why the US military and the US intelligence community has invested so deeply in this new Syrian government over the last 12 months, which is because they recognize that if there is any chance of dealing a durable defeat to ISIS in Syria, it will always have to have been through a sovereign government, not through a non-state actor. And so that's going to be the key as we start to hear about US military withdrawals from northeastern Syria, which are ongoing. It doesn't mean that the US military is disengaging from Syria. It just means that that our engagement is changing. And Damascus is now the focal point for that counterterrorism investment. But that threat is going to be real as 2026 really gets going. And it's going to be much more urban. And it's going to be targeting the government. It's going to seek to target minority communities to try to suggest the government is either incapable or unwilling of protecting them. Very much like what ISIS's predecessors did in Iraq 20 years ago after the invasion of Iraq. They sought to trigger a kind of sectarian internal civil war and undermine a very fragile transitional government.
So, Charles, just one last question before we wrap up, since I know we just have a minute left. But we talked about those tribal defections in January that essentially collapsed SDF rule over large parts of the Northeast. I mean, these tribes are still armed. Are they not really fully inside the state's chain of command? Is Damascus consolidating power through these tribes that have converted to the government, or are these tribes a long-term liability to the government?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the tribes have emerged as a very significant challenge for the government. We've been talking mostly about northeastern Syria here, but in July 2025, there was a major kind of conflagration in the Druze majority. That's a religious minority community in Syria, in a Druze majority governorate or province called Sweda in southern Syria in July. And, again, I don't have the time and we don't need to get into how and why and when or whatever else. But the key thing that happened in Sweda was that when the government forces withdrew in order to try to de-escalate, tribal forces launched a nationwide mobilization in Syria and then just basically invaded Sweda. They did it because tribal Bedouin communities in Sweda were being attacked by Druze militiamen. And so this tribal mobilization was launched in kind of solidarity to protect their tribal brethren in Sweda. The danger here is that in a very heavily tribal northeastern region of Syria, the tribes are the core kind of social structure. And so when we were looking at the second half of 2025 and everyone knew that if the SDF failed to integrate, there would be some form of conflict, the government knew that the tribes were going to be a potential real problem. Because when the tribes went into Sweda, they committed major massacres, and the government was unable to restrain them. I should add, government forces, before they withdrew, committed their own crimes. But when they withdrew and tribes went in, all hell broke loose. So from the government's perspective, when they were facing this SDF challenge late last year, their main fear was, what if the tribes try to do a Sweda all over again? And so President Ahmed al-Sharaa appointed somebody who actually he'd had a very difficult relationship with in the past, but he appointed this guy called Abu Ahmed Zakour to be the special presidential envoy on tribal affairs, which is a very long-winded way of basically saying he was the person whose responsibility it was first to engage with Syria's tribes all across the country, and secondarily to basically put them under the unofficial influence of the government. They're not a military force, you can't put them in the Ministry of Defense or something, but to have the kind of relationships whereby if a crisis begins, you call up that tribal leader and say, please don't march on town A, leave it to the government. It's the government's responsibility. And so to a large extent, that was a successful initiative. The tribes did take some matters into their own hands over the last few weeks in northeastern Syria, but they never entered Kurdish majority areas. So they took control of their areas. They sought to try to kind of team up with the Ministry of Defense on several front lines, but in almost all occasions were told to leave. And so at least it's been an improvement. But going forward, last thing I'll conclude on, is whilst I remain cautiously optimistic that this integration agreement will work, one of my sources of concern is around the tribes. Not necessarily that they're going to, launch a mass mobilization and invade Kurdish-held areas, but that those nearly 900 men I mentioned earlier who were
Yeah.
arrested. No one knows where they are. They're still in Kurdish prisons somewhere in these pockets of northeastern Syria. Now, if we still don't find out where they are, and there's supposed to be prisoner exchanges coming up in the next week or so, but if we still don't get those 870 or so men released, the tribes will see that as an affront, if not, a declaration of war or a necessity for declaring war on the SDF. And so there are these unresolved issues around prisoners and detainees that will potentially present real stumbling blocks on this integration agreement. And so, it's to be determined what happens. Now, if all those men are found and they are released, thank God, alhamdulillah in Arabic, because we will have avoided potentially a new trigger of massive conflict. But if they're not, I am very worried about what will come after that. Because tribes work on the basis of honor systems, whereby if somebody is killed from your tribe, there has to be a recompense or a repayment for that, and that will prove very difficult challenge for the government to control.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll see what 2026 holds. Hopefully, we can be optimistic, but there are a lot of tensions and flashpoints. Charles, thank you so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate it. For our audience, I will have a link to Charles' bio on MEI, which has further links to a lot of his writings, a lot of his works. Please follow Charles on Twitter. He is very much actively updating his audience on the latest in Syria, on the latest in integration, and it's a great source of information. It's how I've been tracking a lot of what's been going on over the last few months to a year. So, Charles, thanks so much for joining me here today.
Sure thing. Thanks so much for having me.
For more conversations from the Burn Bag, you can check us out on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube, or wherever you really listen to podcasts. You can also follow us at Burn Bag Pod on Instagram, Twitter, and on LinkedIn. Please subscribe and follow for more great conversations. Thank you.